Welcome to the third day of our International Compost Awareness Week webinar series. Today we'll be talking about how to grow your own food at home, a primer from raised beds to lawn conversion. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I'd like to start off with a little bit of background on the Composting Association of Vermont for those who may be new to our organization. We were founded in 2002, really based on the belief that increasing the use of compost in our communities will improve soil health, water quality, and our collective resilience to climate change. Our mission is to advance the production and use of compost as vital to soil health through practices that contribute to water quality, plant vigor, and environmental resilience, and to demonstrate the value of compost through education, policy, outreach, and partnerships to reduce waste, capture energy, and create jobs. We're a small 501c3 organization based in Heinsberg, Vermont. We are a member association. Our members are the solid waste management entities in Vermont, policymakers, practitioners, educators, and concerned citizens. And if you're interested in learning more about joining our organization, you can find that on our website at compostingvermont.org. This webinar series is part of the 25th Annual International Compost Awareness Week, which is a program run in the US by the Composting Council Research and Education Foundation. The theme this year, Soil Loves Compost, is really geared towards emphasizing the beneficial relationship between healthy soil, successful plants, and better landscape results through compost use. One of the main goals is to engage as many people as possible and to provide education about compost and the value of diverting organics from the landfill. If you'd like to share what you're learning today or any of the recordings through your social media, these are the hashtags that you can use. I also want to give just a little plug for the rest of the webinars we have. Tonight, there'll be a compost literacy book discussion hosted by CAV member Lamoille Soil, and they'll be talking about Cows Save the Planet. Tomorrow, we'll be joined by Carl from Soil for Climate to talk about compost as a climate solution. And then later in the afternoon tomorrow, I'll be one of the speakers for Food System Friday webinar series hosted by Prescott College, focused on composting for your garden in the time of COVID-19. I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our sponsors. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to put this on for you. Addison County Solid Waste Management District, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, Community Bank, Rich Earth Institute, Nature Cycle, and Vermont Natural Ag Products are supporting us today. So I'll be starting us off with just a little bit of background on Victory Gardens and our Vermont Victory Garden campaign. And we're very happy to have Mark Krawczyk here with us today to give us a primer on how to convert lawn to garden, nourish existing garden beds, establish raised beds, and planting containers. Mark completed his bachelor's degree from the University of Vermont in 2001. He then spent close to 4 years apprenticing with mentors throughout the US and Europe and earned a diploma of applied permaculture from the British Permaculture Association, as well as dual diplomas in education and site design from the Permaculture Institute of the Northeast. In 2012, Mark and his wife Amy began putting their skills and vision into practice, building their home and homestead from the ground up in Vermont's Champlain Valley. Dan Goosen will also be joining us today to facilitate the Q&A. Dan is the General Manager of Green Mountain Compost and the Secretary for the CAV Board of Directors. The Victory Gardens for Community Resilience. With more time at home, Victory Gardens are a means to increasing food security and decreasing resilience on the industrial food system. There's been an increased interest in gardening, especially with the stay home, stay safe order or shelter in place orders in other states. Working the soil and gardening can help combat isolation and provide a sense of physical and mental well-being. And with programs like Plant an Extra Row, you can grow a little extra to donate to your local food shelf at a time when they're seeing steady increases in demand. Part of CAV's statewide campaign is we've established a resource page on our website. So we have resources on compost and the Victory Garden, healthy soil being the key to success, and how to learn more about the connections of healthy soil and productive gardens. We'll have a list of all of the local compost producers throughout the state of Vermont. If you're in other states, of course, you'll need to figure out your own list. But we do have direct links to where You can find those products throughout the state, all the distributors as well as at the farms or compost facilities themselves. We have a lot of resources on composting and COVID-19 and the safety precautions, really emphasizing that composting is an essential service during this time, both on the solid waste management side as well as the food system side, supporting the food system. We have a number of good links for both backyard and community composting basics. And then while we're not really the gardening experts here at the Composting Association of Vermont, we've linked out with partners like Vermont Extension Master Gardeners Program and Vermont Community Gardens Network, among others, to provide those gardening resources for you. This is really the first in what will become a webinar series about Victory Gardens. And you can learn more at compostingvermont.org/Victory Gardens. If we have time at the end, we did just launch that webpage. And so I'll go ahead, give a short tutorial on those tools that are available there. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark so he can get us going on today's content.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Natasha and Dan. It's a pleasure to be here and have some time to share with you all. Looks like we got some great attendance and great introduction, and what an exciting time to be thinking about gardening, especially on a day like this. We're going to just dive right in here: how to grow your own food at home, a primer from raised beds to lawn conversion. And here we've got an image of a front yard that's just completely stacked with productivity and exemplary of some of the techniques we're going to talk about this morning. And so Natasha already gave a little bit of an introduction to the whole concept of Victory Gardens, but I think it's really interesting just to kind of nest ourselves at this point in time within this larger historical context and just recognize that with urbanization and suburban development and stuff, these are patterns that we've seen expressed throughout our history, all over the world. And the idea of just looking at how we can more efficiently and effectively utilize the spaces around us as, alternatives or complements to lawn. And so I'm just going to kind of launch into a little bit of strategy in terms of like how to start to proceed when it comes to thinking about establishing gardens in the spaces where you live and spend your time. And so I think we're not going to spend too much time on it, but I would feel like I'm being negligent if I don't just acknowledge the fact that it's a great idea to test your soil before you start gardening. And I'll briefly get into that in just a minute, especially in more urban locations where contamination like lead or contaminants like lead could be a concern. But also just in terms of, gaining some baseline information about, the nature of your soils and, what might be in excess or deficient and how you'd respond. And then to some degree, we're all going to be doing a certain level of design when it comes to figuring out, how big is our garden? Where is it going to fit within our landscape? What type of materials might we want to use in constructing or establishing these gardens? What are some of the challenges that we're going to face and how are we going to respond to those? And then what are the resources that we really want to capitalize on, just based on perhaps we have this kind of optimal sunny microclimate that we want to make sure we utilize thoroughly for our heat-loving crops, and then we can use a little more protected shady spots for things that don't need as much sun, especially during the peak of summer. Then our third step is this: we're going to be preparing our soil or preparing our beds, getting that space ready to go, and then of course the really exciting part of it all is that we establish that garden, we plant it out. I just grabbed this image off the internet here, but a neat way of just thinking about how you envision the use of space, and also look at how we might try to complement like annuals with perhaps fruit trees or berry bushes or rain gardens and other aspects that all kind of fit into this larger aspect of kind of ecological and edible landscaping. Although we're focusing today largely on vegetable gardening. So just a couple little things, note on soil health and safety. just to, again, just be aware of our surroundings and where we're located. I think UVM Soil Testing Lab has a couple of different options for the type of test that they offer. And for most of us, the home grounds test, which I believe is $15, is kind of, we're going to give you like your baseline information about the macronutrients in your soil organic matter and pH and some micronutrients. They also offer a heavy metals option for an additional $10. And again, this is just to say that if you are in a location where you might be concerned about contaminants, I think it's a wise place for us to begin, because we want to make sure that we're growing food that's, healthy and safe for people of all ages to consume. And so in some cases, we might find that our soil is contaminated. And I'm just going to share two real quick strategies that you might consider in that case. And I think for most of us, the best strategy would just be to grow in raised beds as opposed to growing in the soil, like in the native soil below. Ideally, you have some type of weed barrier lining the base of your raised bed, just to try to, prevent plant roots from, reaching into that native soil that may have contamination. A much longer term strategy would be some type of bioremediation, where essentially you're using plants or fungi to either uptake contaminants or break them down, depending on what they are, if they're like a metal versus a compound. But that's a much longer term and complex strategy. So I'm just kind of addressing the fact that it's an option, although, it's you definitely want to have a good knowledge base before you proceed with that, and just recognize that it's going to significantly delay the time before you'd be ready to start planting. And then just a couple other things, if your soil is contaminated, that as best I understand, I'm not an expert here, but I have done a fair bit of research on it on my own, that contaminants, especially metals, tend to accumulate more in the tissues of plants and tend not to be transferred into the fruits. And so generally, like a plant like a tomato or a pepper is going to be a lot safer than especially root crops. And this next slide here kind of illustrates that. This was Australia's science research organization just looked at plant uptake of heavy metals. I don't want to bum us all out with this stuff, but again, this is just me trying to do my due diligence. And here we see, some of the plants with just plant species broken down by their relative uptake of heavy metals. I'm not going to go through all this, but I believe this slideshow will be available online in the coming weeks, so you all could refer to that later on if that was something that you're interested in. So now that we've gotten that all out of the way, we're getting into more of the fun stuff. And I think it's really important for us to start out. Like I work personally as an educator. We have a small farm, and I also do like design and consulting work for landowners. And we always have to start off with our goals. And especially for those of us that where we're not the only stakeholder that's going to be managing the garden, it's really important that we take a little bit of time to put those goals on paper, and we sit down together and think about, what are the species that we want to grow? So perhaps we're thinking about what do we spend the most money on, and what might be, the best yield for us in terms of the investment we're putting into our garden, because we have limited space. And so we're going to try to be really strategic about growing the things we love most and that are also the most valuable, that would save us the most money. Our goals might also relate to the type of garden that we're interested in. And so that could be that we know that we want raised beds because we want to elevate our planting space and make it easier and more convenient for us to work rather than working at ground level. Or that we're really just interested in an herb garden. Or that we want to look a little bit more at small fruits. We also want to think about like desired yields. Obviously, for some of us that are in more space limited scenarios, we need to be really strategic about how we utilize the space that we have, and just realistic about what we can glean from those areas. but are we looking to kind of just supplement our diet during the summertime? Are we looking at trying to grow storage crops so that we can be eating from, a cold cellar or cold storage all throughout the winter? Obviously, budget's going to be a huge constraint for folks generally, or is at least a huge factor in deciding like what we're able to invest and how we can strategically go about establishing a garden. And so, it can be somewhat expensive depending on the strategies that you use to get a garden going. And so just being able to put pen to paper and think about how much financial resource we have that we can dedicate, in a given year is also, pretty key. And then just also being realistic about like how much time and space are available for us. So these are all kind of pieces that fit into that bigger goals question. And again, like I can't overemphasize the value of taking the time to put this down and like have a discussion with other family members or stakeholders in the household. I think a really great way for us to start is to just print out a map, like an aerial map of our site, and just start to think about some of the different characteristics of our landscape. This is a friend's home in the San Francisco Bay Area, actually. But this is just like a quick kind of bubble diagram, just looking at what's already happening. This is actually sort of a design for their backyard, but just a bubble diagram, thinking about, where is it wet? Where is it shady? Where is it especially hot and sunny? Where do people move through the landscape? So that we can really start to just, more strategically plan out the use of space. One of my favorite principles, like design principles and I guess proverbs to some degree, is apparently originated in China. The idea that the gardener's footsteps are the best fertilizer. And so we might find that we have a great pocket of soil with really good sun, but it's on the far end of the property and we never actually make it over there. And if we're not paying attention, if we're not engaged with our garden, it's going to suffer. And we might not be optimizing the potential yields that it can provide. And so in some cases, it may be that we need to compromise and look at, our path from our front door to the car or to the mailbox as being, a much more useful and effective place for us to really put a lot of energy in establishing a garden. And so just like choosing where your garden is going to go is, one of the most essential aspects of your garden design in the long run. I'm sure a lot of you already have that in mind, but it's a hard thing to change once you've started to invest in it. So for the bulk of this talk, we're just going to look at a range of different garden establishment techniques. And I'm not going to run through this whole table here because I've broken it down by each technique in the coming slides. But just to say that, for the 5 techniques we're going to cover, raised beds, rototilling, solarizing, sheet mulching, and container gardening, all of them have pros and cons. And so it's up to us to decide what's going to be the best fit for our context, for our needs, and just recognize that everything's got, its limitations as well as its benefits. 2 techniques I'm not going to talk about, but I just wanted to mention. One that's, very straightforward, although it's a lot of work, is literally just like removing the sod from an existing lawn. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. In this case, in this illustration, this man has, you can kind of see it on the right-hand side of the image. He's probably rented a tool called a sod cutter. And that is something, I think I've rented them from Home Depot in Williston. It basically is a gas-powered walk-behind tool, kind of like a rototiller, but it has a blade with an adjustable depth that actually just cuts underneath the roots of the existing grass or vegetation. And if it's, a really dense sod, you can just kind of roll it up and lay it to the side. and that's going to give you bare soil to plant into. There's depending on how deep you're able to go, it's possible that you don't actually eliminate the existing vegetation that's there, which just means you might have some persistent weed issues. Also, don't forget that some of the most fertile, the greatest fertility in your soil is going to be in the uppermost layers of your soil. And so all that rolled up sod, there's a lot of nutrient and biology that's kind of bound up there. So that sod will become a valuable resource. So what some people will do is they'll put those rolls of sod off to the side and just allow them to decompose over time. And then, once it's broken down, just reapply that to the surface of their garden. But, some folks would simply just remove the sod and then plant their garden straight into that, perhaps adding some compost and, doing a few other things to help improve fertility. It's something it's very labor intensive, but you can also do this with a shovel or a mattock. But it is, a fairly straightforward way just to convert lawn into garden. And then another technique that I'm not really getting into, but, if you're interested, you can do a little more research on your own, is called double digging. And this is kind of generally assuming that you have already removed the sod or the perennial vegetation that's already existing. And the idea here, though, is to really try to create a very loose and friable planting bed for your garden. And it's very labor intensive because you're essentially, removing the uppermost layer of your soil and then loosening up the layer below, and doing this kind of in a sequential way so that you've created this deep, loose planting bed. And it can be a very productive way to get a garden going, but it's a lot of work. And so the techniques we're going to talk about are looking at how we can, strive towards achieving these types of goals, but without having to do quite as much hard labor in order to get there. And I just want to start off with just a real brief primer on what is soil, because this is the foundation of a healthy garden. And I love slides like this that show us the components of soil by volume, because what blows my mind every time I look at this is the fact that half of a healthy soil is actually the space between the particles. Most of us think of soil as being that mineral rich organic material that we hold in our hands, but 50% of a healthy soil should be the pore space, the spaces between soil, where air and water are held and available for plants and the biology in the soil. So the bulk of the actual matter that makes up our soil is mineral matter, which is clay, sand, and silt. And then the remaining, between maybe 2 and 15%, if you're really lucky, might be soil organic matter, which is the result of root exudates from plants, the excreta from soil biology, and then the decomposition of organic matter over time that make that rich, earthy smell. It's essentially kind of like, the earth having, composted on its own. And that's what's really essential and important for us to sustain, is that soil organic matter. And so everybody's soils are going to be different depending on where you live and, the geological history of the place where you are. And this is, some of us may have heard some of these terms, been a little bit confused about what, a clay loam is or a sandy loam. And I won't describe the details of this, but just to say that, when it comes to the mineral matter component of our soils, the things that, give our soils their texture, there's 3 main components. We have sand, silt, and clay. And all of those have pros and cons. Sand provides really good drainage, but it's not very good at holding on to fertility or water. And so it's more prone to drying out, and it's more prone to the leaching of fertility. And clay at the other end of the continuum is great at holding water, but it can become very waterlogged. it can be really hard to work with because it doesn't tend to want to break up and make for easy planting. And so just finding out a bit more about your soil type can be a really helpful way for you to understand, again, how you're going to need to adjust your management to the conditions around you. Where I live in New Haven in the Champlain Valley, we're on Vergennes clay soils. And it's kind of crazy having to figure out how to establish a garden on these soils because they're just so tight and so dense that it's really challenging to kind of break things up and create a nice planting bed. So it's really a process over time for us to transform our soils to really good garden soils. But our soils are a lot less prone to drying out. And so, we're much better buffered in that regard than someone that's on, floodplain, well-drained, like sandy loam soils. So one place that if you want to find out a bit more about the nature of your soils, the soil texture, there's a website called the Web Soil Survey that the USDA maintains. And it's a little cumbersome to navigate, but you can put in your address and kind of zoom in using a aerial GIS type like aerial map, and it will generate what your soil type is. And again, that's a good way to get some kind of baseline information about the place where you're going to be gardening. What you're getting at when you start to double dig garden beds is essentially just trying to restore pore space to your soils, to loosen things up. Because especially, if we're looking to garden on an existing lawn or like a high trafficked area, it's very likely that a lot of that pore space that we talked about a couple slides ago has gotten smushed, and that the capability for our soils to store water and air has just been diminished. A tool like a broad fork that you see here, which is basically just like a big heavy duty pitchfork, is one way to avoid having to dig deep, but to help kind of loosen up the soils, because as the soils get more compacted, it makes it harder and harder for plant roots to grow and penetrate into the deeper soil profile where water and minerals are going to be more available. So by making it easier for plant roots to grow, they're going to be able to develop a healthier root system, which is going to make the plant just healthier and stronger overall. And so this is one tool that folks might use in order to do that without having to dig. And this is a broad fork in this case. This is a very heavy duty one that this person's holding. It's the company that makes this is called Meadow Creature, based out of Montana, I believe. And I know a number of years ago, I built one in a welding class, and I brought it to the UVM or the Fletcher Free Tool Lending Library in Burlington. And it may well still be there. So if you're kind of in the greater Burlington area, this is the type of tool that you only need for a half day or a day, perhaps, when you're prepping your site. You might be able to just borrow one because it's kind of an expensive implement for someone to buy just for a single use, but it could be a great thing to share with friends or neighbors. Am I falling behind on questions here? Is there anything I should address?
Oh, you're good, Mark.
Okay.
I think most of them have been answered. There's one about mushrooms, but we'll get to that at the end if you have time, and we're through everything else.
Okay, cool. Great. Well, I think we're right on time here, so we should have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so now that we've kind of laid some foundations, we've talked about context, about choosing a site. We've talked a bit about understanding the nature of your existing soils, and just some real fundamental foundational soil science information. Let's just look at some of these individual techniques and talk about the pros and cons. So one of the most common ways people establish and maintain gardens is by rototilling. And there's a lot of benefits to rototilling. Some of the ones that rise to the top for me are that we can quickly transform sod cover into bare soil. It's a bit of work, but the rototiller definitely makes it a much easier job than doing that manually. And one thing that's really nice about rototilling is that at least at the surface layers, it's going to create a really nice loose planting bed. And so that tilling action just kind of churns things up and it breaks up those clods of soil. And it's going to give you like a nice, it's a media with a nice tilth that's going to be, probably pretty easy to even direct seed right into, as well as obviously putting like garden transplants into. It's also a really effective way for us to incorporate any soil amendments right into our soil, just because things are going to get mixed right in. And so, tillage is a really useful tool when used appropriately. These types of tillers often, again, are available for rent from tool rental places. Also probably like kind of box store home improvement centers like Lowe's or Home Depot that have rental outlets. Maybe $50, $75 a day or something like that ought to get you a rototiller. Depending, one note, I rented one from a rental in Middlebury, and it could not even begin to work its way into a dry, dense, heavy clay soil with sod cover. It just didn't have enough power, the machine that I rented. So depending on what you're starting with, there may be situations where it's going to be, these tools would be underpowered. I've seen, again, kind of depending on where you live and the access to the space where you want to garden, I've seen a number of neighbors that have small tractors with rototillers mounted on them that offer rototilling services. That could be the type of thing that, you could put a post on Front Porch Forum if you don't know of somebody. And while you might pay them $50 or $100 an hour to do, or maybe not an hour, but it might be a $50 or $100 charge, the amount of work that they'll get done for you, in many cases, will be saving you a lot of, energy and time. And if it's a large enough area, that could be well worth it too, a small tractor with a PTO-driven rototiller. Of course, there are cons, though, to rototilling as well. One is that rototilling can be very damaging to soil structure and aggregates. The soil aggregates are kind of the clumps of soil particles that, while it's good for us to create a nice planting bed in breaking those particles up to some degree, the soil biological activity over time kind of creates these aggregates. The materials exuded by plant roots and fungi as well are kind of gluing these particles together that help create that pore space and the ability to kind of capture and store mineral nutrients. And so, over time, especially like repeated tillage, can be very damaging and destructive to soil structure. And also because of the fact that it creates this very light, airy planting media when you rototill, that in many cases is going to lead to a loss of soil organic matter, which, if you remember that slide of the pie chart of the components of soil, it's a very small percentage of the total solid component of soil. And so we want to preserve soil organic matter as much as possible, because that's what really kind of adds to the fertility and productivity of our soil. Rototilling also can be really disruptive to soil biology. There's millions of organisms in a teaspoon of soil, of healthy soil, and by churning things up like this in a really aggressive way, that's going to set back those soil biological populations. It's going to break up some of the fungal networks in our soil that are really important for helping connect plants together, and also encourage or increase their ability to absorb water and minerals. And then also, although rototilling creates a really loose planting bed at the surface, at the interface, like at the base of that that tilled bed, the rototiller is actually creating sort of a compacted plow pan layer that can be really restrictive to water infiltrating and also plant roots. And so you might have 5, 6, 8 inches of loose, airy soil to plant into. You may well be creating a plow pan that is going to actually lead to more waterlogging at that 6, 8 inch depth. And also, like we see that in that central illustration there, where on that corn plant on the right has a really nice fibrous, deep reaching root system, and the one on the left is almost completely inhibited at that first kind of cultivator line layer there. And that's where then coming back through perhaps with a broad fork might be a good idea. And so all this to say that, rototilling can be a great way to establish a garden, but as much as we can, if we can avoid, annual tillage, it's going to be much better for our soil health, for the health of our plants, for its ability to store water, etc. And so ideally, we just don't develop a reliance on tillage. So next in our continuum is raised bed gardening. And there's a lot of benefits to raised beds. We can establish a garden in a matter of an hour or a couple hours. So it's pretty fast, and it's relatively easy to construct even with minimal carpentry skills and just a few basic tools. It can be a great way to compensate for poor soil. So we know we have just severely compacted clay, or perhaps it's more like rubble or fill in the backyard, and would be, horrible, really challenging gardening soil that we could improve over many years. But building a raised bed basically, gets us a nice, rich, healthy planting media in a matter of, hours. So it can be a great way of compensating for poor soil. Assuming that the material we fill our bed with is weed free to begin with, or weed seed free, we should start off with a bed that has no weeds. We're not having to outcompete the existing sod cover. And so, that's really handy. And then also because it's kind of disconnected from, well, it's not disconnected, but it's elevated from the soil below. There's a lot less concern about, especially sod and grass kind of creeping in from the perimeter and making its way into the garden bed. And then I think one that's really important for a lot of us, especially as we get a little older, is that it just makes accessibility a lot easier for us because it elevates the planting bed. So we're not kneeling, it brings it to a more comfortable height. And then, of course, there are some downsides to raised beds too. One is that, in most cases, we're buying a lot of these materials. And so it can start to get a little bit costly. It requires some construction skills and tools that we might not all have ready access to. In most cases, folks are going to use wood as their main material to retain the soil within the raised bed. And that has a limited lifespan. It's going to decay with time. And another is that, we're basically building a container that we're putting our plants in. And because of the fact that it's still connected to the soil below, but it's elevated, it can be a bit more prone to drying out. And so we just have to be a bit more careful and conscientious about making sure that our beds stay well watered, especially, if you were dealing with, this is a beautiful construction here in this slide. But if we're assuming those are, 6 or 8 inch high boards, that's, 2 feet of well-drained, aerated soil that, on a series of sunny, dry, windy days is just going to need a lot more attention when it comes to watering than a garden that's just planted right in the ground. So when it comes to building raised beds, we have a number of different options as far as materials go. Wood is going to be one of the most common ones and the most, in some cases, inexpensive. as opposed to something like stone, unless you already have stone available on site. And these are, really incredibly beautiful planting beds here, but you can see one downside to stone as a material is that it's a lot less efficient in terms of the use of space, just because of the nature of the stones. The thickness of those stones is really stealing a lot of potential garden space from us, even though it's occupying the same area that, a similar sized wood framed raised bed would. But if you already have stone on your site, that can be a great way to just contain the soil within. Old bricks would be one option, or concrete blocks. They don't have to be old, but that would be one way to kind of cut down on costs, is just kind of upcycling materials that oftentimes people have laying around in piles you can find for free or cheap on Craigslist or through Front Porch Forum. And then I just have here, I mentioned one of the limitations about wood is that it's going to decay. And so, you might think of using a wood option that's less prone to decay, like pressure treated wood, as helping kind of counteract that. But of course, if we're growing food within this construction, we want to make sure that it's safe. And so definitely avoid pressure treated wood. And all this to say too, that really raised beds, the only reason we need a material to enclose the raised bed is just to keep the soil from spilling out into the paths, or the area surrounding the garden bed. So if you're only building up 4 or 6 inches of raised bed, it might be that you can get away with just kind of semi-sloped sides and nothing that's retaining it. And so the only purpose, the function of these materials is just to allow us to contain the soil within. And I'm sure I'm missing a few options. I mean, you could get very creative with, I've seen raised beds lined with, metal roofing. I can't speak to whether or not there would be any concerns about contamination or leaching from metal roofing. I don't think that there would be, but I would want to do a little bit more research beforehand, and just know, the materials that you'd be constructing it from. But here's just a few guidelines when it comes to thinking about like the dimensions of your raised bed. And, this could also tie in, at least in terms of the bed width, to all of these discussions, or all of these strategies. Generally speaking, I think that it's most effective to make garden beds, about 3 to 4 feet wide. And that's because you want to be able to reach the center of the bed from both sides without having to be, too overly extended. And I often go with a 4 foot wide raised bed, mainly because most lumber comes in increments of 2 foot lengths, with 8 foot being the shortest one. And so, if I cut an 8 foot board in 2, I have 2 4 foot pieces. But if you're if your body frame is a little smaller, or you're not quite as nimble as some of the younger amongst us, a 3 foot bed is probably a little bit wiser, just in terms of like your own ability to reach the center of the bed. Beds can be as long as is practical, 6 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot. But the longer the bed is, you're going to need to provide some supports along the center, just to keep, this is assuming you're building out of wood in this case. Once you get to a 10 or a 12 foot bed, you may need to put in, a stake in the center, or two stakes, kind of evenly spaced, breaking the length of the bed into thirds, just because the weight of the massive soil that you put into the bed is going to start to bow out the walls. But there's really no limit to the length of your raised bed. And the main thing is just going to be thinking about how you can access it from different sides. And the longer you make it, the harder it's going to be to cross to the other side. When it comes to the dimension of the materials, again, this is all, I'm assuming most people building raised beds would be using wood. I usually select 2x8 boards. And just keep in mind that if boards bought from like a general lumberyard that are planed boards are going to be actually 1.5 inches thick, 2x material. would be 1.5 inches thick. If you go much thinner than that, you just don't have a lot of material thickness to work with, because over time all wood is going to decay, and so having extra thickness is going to make it last longer. And then additionally, it's also just going to make it a bit sturdier and more resistant to kind of bowing or breaking under the pressure of the soil within. And then as far as the width of the boards, if it's a 2x6 or a 2x8 or a 2x10, that's really up to you. I like using 8-inch wide boards because I feel like, you know, that's it's kind of a good price point generally. 8 inches feels like a nice depth for a garden bed to start. And then what I've done, like with our own raised beds, is we started off just with a single course of 2x8 boards. And then a few years later, as our resources allowed, we just added an extra layer of 2x8s. So now our raised beds, our raised beds are built from rough sawn lumber, which is a true 2 inches by 8 inches. And so our raised beds are 16 inches deep. And that just makes it a lot more comfortable for us and gives us, you know, that much more depth of really good topsoil on top of our compacted clay just outside the front of our house here to plant in. So you can think about it as kind of a modular thing that you can kind of expand on as you know, your resources are available. There's a number of different ways that you can make the connections between the boards at the corners, because that's what really gives the bed its strength. This is, again, all discussion about wood-built raised beds. Don't skimp on your fasteners. You know, what I've they make there's a number of different types of brackets and, you know, kind of corner connectors that are available, like commercially. I'm sure Gardener Supply has a number of different options. You can probably buy raised bed kits that are kind of ready-made with pre-cut lumber. I've found that it's just been very effective for me to just use really nice screws to make strong connections at the corners where the boards butt up against each other. And no steel corner brackets or anything like that has been necessary. But you want to make sure you're using really good screws to do that. So I would say, like, use heavy duty decking screws. I prefer the ones with the star drive rather than like the Phillips Plus type head. And I'd say use at a minimum like a 3.5 inch long screw or longer if possible. And if you want to go really heavy duty, look into timber lock screws or GRK fasteners. This image here is GRK fasteners, and they are they're as strong as like a lag bolt, but can be just driven in simply with a standard like drill driver. You don't need to pre-drill a hole. They're expensive, but you don't need that many for these types of constructions. I would generally use at least 3 fasteners per joint. I'd use at least 2 and often 3, you know, 1 an inch from the top, 1 an inch from the bottom, and 1 at the center or something like that, maybe 1.5 inches from the top and bottom. With a narrower board, you could get away with two fasteners. But just to say that, you know, what's going to keep this all together is your fasteners, so don't skimp there. And then here's just a little cross-section illustration of what a raised bed could look like. In this case, you know, we see that they've used those redwood, they have redwood in this case, you know, wooden posts in the corners, so that they're not actually screwing the ends of the boards together. They have those posts. That's going to be a really strong way to make those connections at the corners, that you're actually fastening the raised bed boards to the posts. It's just going to be a little bit more wood for you to cut and use, but not a significant addition of expense. Not too much else I think that I need to say here. I'm not sure why they have the bottom lined with hardware cloth, but I'm assuming that they're doing that to try to screen out rodents from getting into the raised bed. And I've heard of folks doing that. Remember that, you know, before you fill the raised bed, that's kind of your last opportunity to address any issues in the soil below. For folks that are concerned about contamination in the soil and they're trying to isolate their garden from rooting in contaminated soil, I know people will line the bottom of the bed with like a geotextile type weed block fabric. You wouldn't want to use plastic because you want to make sure that, you know, water can still percolate through the bottom of the bed. But that would be one strategy, again, in contaminated soils. And then there's some debate as to whether or not you should remove the sod or existing vegetation from underneath the raised bed. If you have the time and energy to do it, I think it's probably not a bad idea, just because it's going to, especially if it's a shallower depth of your bed, it's going to just eliminate most possibilities of the weeds underneath actually colonizing your bed. I've usually not done that too, not removed the existing vegetation and been okay. But if you're concerned about that, now's the time to do it. If you have a broad fork or a garden fork and want to loosen up the soil underneath too, it's a great opportunity. And then just a couple more things on raised beds. So first, you need to determine how big is your bed? What's the volume? And I'm not going to give us a geometry refresher here, but you know, length times width times height is going to give us volume. And you've got to make sure all your units are the same. So you convert height into feet. And there's 27 cubic feet in a cubic yard, which is how most of our soil media is sold. And so basically a 4 foot by 8 foot by 8 inch high raised bed is going to take about 3/4 of a cubic yard to fill. And for those of you that want some help doing some of this math, Gardener Supply has a soil calculator on their website that allows you to just kind of plug in dimensions and find out what you need. And what to fill them with? Well, compost, like pure compost, is too dense and kind of heavy isn't quite the right word, but it's going to lead to waterlogging, that there's too much organic matter, not enough mineral material in the mix. And so a lot of our fine compost operations like Green Mountain Compost in Vermont sell a product that's kind of ideally blended for these applications. And so Green Mountain Compost, I believe it's called the bulk garden mix, which, as it says here, a blend of compost, sand, silt, and peat moss that's been finely screened. And so basically that is a product that's engineered just for this application. And that's going to be, you know, pretty ideal for most cases. And you can assume that depending on where you're purchasing this material, if you're buying it, it's going to cost between $30 and $50 a cubic yard. I'm very close to Foster Brothers in Middlebury, the Moodoo manufacturer, and they call their kind of equivalent product all-purpose compost. I'm sure Vermont Compost Company has their kind of equivalent product as well. But just to say that pure compost isn't really what you want to fill the bed with. It's compost that's been kind of lightened with materials that have good drainage as well, and are going to kind of add to create a bit more of an airy texture within. A friend of mine had a bunch of compost that his family had been making over the course of like 5 years, and he just blended it with a pile of kind of silty soil that he found in his woods, and was finding that was working quite well for him as well. And so you could kind of engineer and blend your own mix. But once we start doing the math and figuring out how much material we need, we recognize that like it's a lot of material, and that's where some of the big costs might add up. One technique I've used has been taking organic matter, especially like small branches and sticks and things, and laying those in the bottom of the bed, which is kind of like a hybrid technique called hugelkultur. It's an adaptation of hugelkultur to kind of fill up some of that space in the bottom, so I can just get away with using less fill. And that all that wood material is going to help hold on to water, and it's going to slowly break down and become soil over time. But you don't really want to skimp on on your soil. And one last thing I just wanted to say here, I realized I kind of skipped over it. If you're building your beds with wood, some of the preferred species would be things like cedar, hemlock, or larch. Cedar being the most rot resistant of those three. Hemlock and larch are moderately rot resistant, not great, but it will be very expensive to use cedar. And so just to keep in mind that whatever you choose, if it's wood, the more rot resistant, the longer it's going to last, but it's generally going to be more expensive. But even just, your typical pine, spruce, or fir materials will give you several years, maybe as much as 10 years, and they're going to be a lot less expensive. And, at the end of the day, if you start to see decay making a board really weak, then, you may have to pull that board out or just, deconstruct the bed. The soil's going to spill out a little bit. You mound it back up on the center and, just replace those boards once they've rotted. So I see I probably have another 10 minutes or so before we get into questions, which I think should work okay for our Q&A kind of question end. But I see questions coming in through the chat, so thanks to whoever's answering those. Keep them coming.
Yeah, and just so people know, we're sorry to interrupt. We're gonna hold most of the question answering for the end, but keep them coming in for sure. And if there's a clarifying question during the presentation, we can interrupt Mark for that.
Yeah, and feel free, Dan, to table a question if you think it's going to get addressed later, if you haven't already been doing that. Thank you.
Yep, you've hit quite a few of them already, so keep going.
Awesome. So next, sheet mulch or lasagna gardening. Here's some of the pros and cons of this. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit just to make sure I get through everything. So I hope I'm not going too fast for anybody. But this is the idea of essentially just kind of composting in place with a thin layer of or several layers perhaps of different types of organic material right on top of existing sod. And some of the pros to sheet mulch would be that you're literally kind of building soil in place, that it doesn't require any tillage or inversion to get things started. You can do this right on top of existing sod. It's going to increase your soil fertility and organic matter because, again, this is kind of just a slow release compost approach to establishing a bed. And you don't really have to do any digging. It's all about just building up in layers. And you'll see some illustrations in the coming slides here. But in this one here, we see grass clippings, newspaper and cardboard, leaves, grass clippings, compost material, water. It's kind of going to depend on what you have available and what you're looking to grow and your timeline for when you want to grow, depending on how you approach this. But some of the downsides to sheet mulch or lasagna gardening would be that it requires a lot of material to do this. And so you kind of need to start stockpiling materials in order to get things ready to go. And it's going to take a little bit of time for some of those materials to break down and become soil and become a planting bed that you can, use straight away, especially if you're looking to direct seed. And then it just needs to be done carefully to kill weeds. And so like, if you look at this illustration, it looks like they've got a path that they've covered with cardboard. And I can see some grass kind of poking out in some spots. Well, that is not going to suppress the grass underneath if there's gaps. So if you're using cardboard or newspaper, what those are serving as is basically just a weed barrier that's going to kill whatever's underneath it. You have to make sure that all those seams are really generously overlapped because these, the existing vegetation is going to find its way in between those cracks, and you'll no longer have that kind of weed-free planting bed. And so the cardboard or newspaper is really all about just killing what's underneath. And let's say that you were using a material that might already have weed seeds in it, like you got a nice delivery of bedding from a neighbor that has horses. Well, it's very likely that it's mixed in with hay that has weed seeds in it, etc. So just make sure that you put that underneath your weed block. In this case, it looks like they've put a really nice, healthy, rich, compost raised bed type mix right on the surface there that they can plant straight into. So that should be a material then that is, known to be pretty pure and not be bringing in new weeds. It looks like they've got that on top of some old leaves and perhaps even some hay. If you're using hay, like mulch hay, again, that's probably got a lot of weed seeds in it. So put it underneath that, that cardboard layer. And I was watching a great video from a British gardener named Charles Dowding the other day. It's Dowding. Also Lee Reich, who's a Hudson Valley-based horticulturalist and author, who are huge fans of this general approach to gardening. And really all they do is they lay down cardboard or newspaper, and then about 4 inches of like a healthy topsoil, compost, kind of raised bed mix on top of that. And they just plant straight into that. And they say if you've done effective weed control underneath, you'll have a weed-free bed straight away. So this is essentially like building a raised bed without walls to retain it. And Charles Dowding was saying 4 inches is what he's found to be kind of the perfect threshold, where you have enough depth for plants to get established before their roots hit the cardboard as it's decomposing. And so that can be, a really quick way for you to get gardens started. Of course, it can look a little unsightly at the outset. I would definitely recommend putting the material on top of that cardboard in the paths. Wood chips are a great option if you have access to those, both to protect it and also make it look nicer, and also to keep that cardboard from drying out and blowing away. I'm going to skip this just for time's sake. It was really just an idea that if you're mixing different materials together, by building up a bunch of layers in your lasagna garden, that ideally you're thinking about balancing your carbon and nitrogen ratios. So if you got a bunch of planer shavings from a sawmill, like wood planer shavings, that's a very high carbon material. So you want to make sure that you're buffering that with materials that have a higher nitrogen content, like manures or composted manure, or food scraps or something like that. But it allows you to really rapidly transform a space. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples of what, we all bring our biases to the table when it comes to how we get things started and the techniques we use. And I'm a big fan of sheet mulching. This is a friend's backyard. We planted out what's called an edible forest garden with fruit trees and berries and some nut trees, etc. So this is just planting these tiny little fruit trees, straight into the soil in her backyard. And we had leaves, mulch hay. We got a bunch of horse manure and horse bedding, and layered that up. And that was, the first season. And I think that was about 2 years later. You can see that, there's very little weed intrusion within the planting beds. We wanted to try to transform the path, and so just laid down newspaper. You can see here the seams are really well overlaid, and then put down, we had more horse bedding, which was just free for us, so laid down a few inches of that, and then like a topsoil mixed on top of that, and then broadcast white clover seed as kind of a lower growing path ground cover. So just a couple examples of what lasagna gardening can look like. It can be a great technique, and if you can do that the season before you want to plant, you'll be that much better off. But if you put down enough soil on top of that weed barrier, you should be good this season as well. And 2 more quick techniques here, and then we'll break, or we'll transition into Q&A. Solarizing or occlusion, essentially laying down plastic or tarps just on top of whatever that existing vegetation is to kill what's there. And there's a lot of benefits to this. One is that it's like almost no labor. It's the labor required to lay down a tarp and make sure that it's, well battened down so it won't blow away in the wind. If done long enough, it's going to kill perennial vegetation, your sod, grass, whatever, without inverting or damaging soil structure. It can also kill weed seeds. So you could create kind of a sterile planting bed, just by, keeping a tarp stretched out across the ground. Some of the downsides, one is that it just requires a plastic that over time is going to phytodegrade and start to kind of break up into smaller pieces. It may have some negative effects on the soil biology in the top inch or two, just because of the increased temperatures. But the big one is often that you have to be, ideally a season ahead. So if you were doing this summer, that would be a great way to prep for a garden you could plant into next season. So for those of you that maybe are thinking strategically about planting or expanding your garden from year to year, this could be a really easy way to think about, saving yourself a lot of work next year. And a lot of no-till based vegetable growers, like at more commercial scales, have been starting to go with the solarizing or occlusion method as a way just to kind of minimize tillage and also reduce a lot of the pressures from perennial weeds. And last, I'm going to briefly talk about container gardening. And I'll just preface this by saying I have limited experience with container gardening, like for growing vegetables. We have, rosemary and a fig tree and some sage and stuff that we all overwinter in our house. And then of course, many of us have house plants, so we've already been container gardening. But this can be a really great technique for those of us that don't have a lot of space to work with. If we live in a second story apartment and have a tiny backyard, or we're, our soil suspect in terms of the, potential for contamination or just, poor fertility or low quality soils. Essentially you could think of a container garden as just a mini raised bed that's really modular and easy for us to move around and be adaptable. So the main downside I see to container gardening is that you lose the connection to the soil underneath. And so because of that, it means your plant roots are limited in terms of like how deep they can go. And also you just need to pay a lot more careful attention to watering and to soil fertility, because you've created kind of this closed, ecosystem that can't communicate with, with that soil underneath. And so it just creates a little bit more responsibility for you as a gardener to make sure that, especially with like black pots, they're really going to heat up in the sun. They're going to be just more prone to drying out. And so you can use almost any type of container, 5-gallon buckets, old milk jugs, water containers, etc. But this is some stuff I found. There's a great kind of fact sheet that Gardener's Supply has on their website. And so if you want to get into more details in a really concise way on container gardening, I have the link there, How to Container Gardening, Gardener's Supply. Use the biggest possible container that you can. It's going to give that much more space, that much more volume for plant roots to occupy. And just, it's going to help buy you a little bit more time to make sure that your plants are, have enough water reserve that, because essentially during the growing season, like during the summer months, you're probably going to need to water your containers almost every single day, unless it's raining. And so just more volume means that you're going to be a little bit better buffered against, the drying out potential. But especially with things that are a little bit more tender that we can move, inside during the winter months. I have friends that have lime trees that actually, and lemon trees that the fruit indoors. So, we can do some really neat things with container gardening for just kind of, extending our climate zone, extending our growing season, and also just, gardening in small spaces or otherwise challenging spaces. And so with that said, I think it's time for us to open things up to a Q&A session, unless there was something we wanted to do before that, but I think we were going to Q&A, right?
I believe that's true. Natasha, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we should go into the questions for Mark, and then hopefully as time allows, we will jump back to Natasha, and she'll give us a quick overview on the new Victory Garden website resource page that has, among other things, a list of all the compost producers in the state of Vermont. And I just wanted to throw a quick plug in there. Thanks, Mark, for calling out Green Mountain Compost Garden Mix. But as he noted, there's almost all of the compost producers in the state do produce similar mixes for raised beds. So no matter where you are in the state, if you go to your local garden center or find your closest compost producer on that site that Natasha will walk us through, you can just ask what they have for filling raised beds, and almost all of them have a really good product for that. So to the questions real quick, Mark, there are a couple real recent ones on some of the methods you just covered, and thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I know I learned a lot, and I've heard a lot of this before, so I'm sure everybody is very appreciative for everything that you covered. A quick one on occlusion and the solarizing. There's a specific question about comfrey. Do you think that would work, and how long would you have to have it covered for that to kill comfrey?
Oh boy, I don't know actually how long it would take to kill comfrey. I'm not sure.
Okay.
If it's in an area where you want to establish a garden as opposed to just killing it, I'm really not sure. I love comfrey, but I know that people have a love-hate relationship with it, because if it's been planted in a place where you don't want it, it's going to be near impossible to get rid of it. It's certainly worth a try, but I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
That's okay. Some of the other questions were around inputs and materials used to make these, and one was around newspaper versus cardboard, if there's a preference for which one. Guessing that cardboard takes longer to decompose. Is that too long? And also some concerns around, are there any toxins with cardboard, glues, inks, chemicals, that sort of thing?
Yep. So I think different gardeners have different preferences between those two materials. I've found that, so one thing that can be really nice about cardboard is especially if you can get stuff from like an appliance store, you can get, large sheets. And so there's just, you need a lot less material at the end of the day, because you're not having to overlap the seams as much. My understanding is that, well, I should have said this, so that's a great question. Avoid any glossy materials. So any kind of advertisements in newspapers or magazines, or glossy cardboard you want to avoid, because as I understand it, there may be heavy metals in the inks used in those cases, but that the inks in newspaper are safe for growing food on or within, and the glues in cardboard also are broken down by biological activity, especially fungi in the soils, and that is really not a health concern for people. Cardboard is going to last longer, and so it's going to just buy you a little bit more time in helping, kill whatever perennial vegetation is underneath, whereas newspaper breaks down faster. And so, those are potential pro-con trade-offs. I saw one question here, does that really eliminate weeds? And I would have to say that yes, it can, but it won't always, and it may require additional applications depending. I don't remember the link. I'll see if I can dig up the link. I don't know if there's a way I can get this out to everybody, but for this Charles Dowding, I think if you search, I'll type in Charles, Dowding, no-till garden video on YouTube. And
Mark, I can also link out to those videos that you referenced. And so when I post the recording and the slides from this on our website, I can just go ahead and link to those videos directly as well for everybody.
Great. Thank you. Basically, I think what becomes really essential is that you maintain a strong perimeter, because especially with grass, the roots will kind of continue to want to creep in from the perimeter. And so you have to make sure that you're kind of establishing that boundary that's going to keep that perennial vegetation from finding its way into the bed. And then, of course, there's always the potential for new seeds to enter the garden just from the environment around. But what you're really trying to do is prevent those kind of rhizome-based incursions from, especially grass, finding its way into your beds.
Great. There was a question about clarification on the inputs for lasagna gardening, specifically what the compostable materials versus the composted materials. The picture you showed had the, nicer finished compost on top. Could you just speak real quickly about where that?
So what I've generally done is, so it kind of depends on your timeline and how much, the cost of materials and what you have readily available as well. So if there's any concern that there's weed seed in a material that you're using in a lasagna garden, that wants to go underneath your weed block layer, because that's the cardboard or newspaper, because you just don't want to be trying to kill existing weeds, but then bringing in new seed and placing it right on top of things. So, but something like tree leaves, like shredded leaves, grass clippings potentially too, those are things that should have minimal weed seeds, if any at all, ideally. And so that could be a safer option to put on top of your weed block layer. And then what I was saying is that some people just real simple strategy, the Charles Dowding, Lee Reich, it was just, straight up, topsoil, raised bed mix, compost, whatever, on top of that weed block altogether. And so I've often used this as a technique to establish more perennial gardens and fruit trees and things of that sort, where I'm not worried about having a media to plant into straight away. And so I wouldn't put nearly as much topsoil on the surface as someone would if that's like a vegetable garden that you're looking to establish.
Great. There are lots of questions about potential pests coming in of the mammalian variety.
Yes.
Other than fencing that you can get at any hardware store, any other tips on preventing pests from getting into your raised beds or other types of gardens?
I don't have, so we have a lot of rabbit pressure at our place, and I'm not sure why this is, and also we have like free ranging poultry around too, which can cause a lot of problems, not necessarily like eating our veggies, but just scratching stuff up. On our raised beds, I just took a strip of chicken wire that I cut from a roll. It's maybe 12 inches wide, and just wrapped the uppermost, I put kind of stakes in at the corners and just wrapped the bed with chicken wire. So I've basically made it a lot harder for rabbits and birds to get into the beds. And in the past couple of years, I haven't had any issues as a result of that. If it's a burrowing animal, that's where I think like potentially a groundhog, and then rodents, the hardware cloth, which is basically just like a small diameter screen. It's heavier duty than window screen, but they make it in like 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch holes. Or, the lattice work is like 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch. They make 1/2 inch as well, but for rodents, you really probably want 1/4 inch. Lining the underside of your bed can be effective in that regard. I don't have a lot to add beyond that, just because it can be really challenging to keep wildlife out of a garden. But we've been lucky, at least with rabbits, that they, for whatever reason, have stopped bothering our vegetables since I added that. One downside, though, to what I did by adding that kind of just, wrapping each raised bed with the chicken wire, is that it makes it a lot more awkward for me to reach in and manage the raised bed. So that's a downside, but that might be the cost of trying to make it rabbit and chicken proof.
Okay. The hardware cloth and the chicken wire bring up another question somebody had about potential or concerns around leaching of metals from galvanized materials or otherwise. And there was another question kind of along the same line. Somebody was wondering about building a raised bed on an asphalt surface, wondering if there was any, what to worry about in terms of leaching there, and would it work to have a raised bed on an asphalt surface if that's your sunniest location?
Yep. So I don't know the answer around galvanized metals. Did we get to a certain point where, like, I live right near Route 7, and if I want to worry about the particulate from all the diesel vehicles and all of that stuff, I could, but we live in an environment where we're surrounded by a lot of toxicity. And so there's a certain point where I try to be aware, but not overly concerned, because there's only so much I can do. I'm not too concerned about leaching from those galvanized materials. But I don't have a confident answer to say that there's no concern, that you shouldn't be concerned. As far as asphalt goes, that could be, it's possible. Like, I tend to always think of leaching as something that's more of a precipitate type activity. I'm sure things could be, absorbed upwards as well. But again, I have less knowledge about it. There's something about asphalt that makes me want to, create some separation between food and that material. Usually, depending on your ownership stake of that space, oftentimes asphalt's only a few inches thick, and you can pry it up with like a pry bar. And if it was just like where the raised bed was going to go, if you had access to like an angle grinder with a large enough wheel, or like a cutoff saw or something like that, you could actually just cut the perimeter of your bed, like score your asphalt, cut the perimeter, and then just pry out the asphalt. And then you'd probably want to landfill that material, but that would at least get rid of everything underneath the bed. It's surprising how thin and easy it is to remove asphalt as compared to concrete, which is probably less a concern also from leaching, but sure, concrete's so much more durable and often thicker.
I would think another option might be to just build a taller raised bed and fill the bottom layer with stone, and there give you that separation. You would need some sort of fabric separation to keep the soil up above the stone, but that could also work.
That's a good idea. Yep.
Natasha, how are we doing on time? Do we have enough time to do the switch? We have a few more questions, but I think we've answered a lot of them. If we want to save time to look at the website, what do you?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left, and we can certainly, if you have another quick question you want to do, or we can switch over and I can just show the website and the resources that we have.
Okay, real quick, maybe there were some questions early on about cultivation and the relative damage of rototilling versus hand cultivation, such as with a hoe, or another question about disc tilling and the relative, potential damage to the soil structure for all of those.
I mean, I think generally the more you can avoid tillage, the better off you are, but there's a certain level where we can't. And so I would just bring it back to always trying to look at it as a really useful tool, but something that we don't want to rely on. I've generally hand-tilled our garden beds, and it's a lot of work. And in some ways, I'm doing similar destruction that I would be using a rototiller, although I don't think I'm getting nearly the same kind of plow pan effect that you would. And if we're talking just like shallow tillage with like a garden hoe, I mean, I always try to keep soil covered with some type of mulch whenever possible. But I think shallow tillage is not going to be nearly as destructive to the soil structure and the biology. And so, I don't think it's going to have the same level of disturbance. Definitely not. And also, I think just as a general order of practice, if you can keep your soils covered with mulch, and that's where I usually spring for the pricey stuff, which is like straw, where I know that, I'm paying $8 or $10 per straw bale. But in theory, you're paying for a material that has no weeds in it. Because if you spend all this time, trying to establish a weed-free bed, you want to make sure you're not importing new seeds with hay or mulch hay or something like that. But just to keep your soils from drying out, from just the impact of the sun, from wind as well, desiccation, etc. Whatever you can do to mulch. Not that that's going to eliminate weeds necessarily, but I think, that's an important detail as much as you can do it.
Great. Mark, thank you so much for all of this wealth of knowledge. And as everybody's aware now at this point, Mark knows a lot about growing food and all the ways you can do it. I would recommend that you check out his website, Keyline Vermont, if you're interested in some of the other stuff that he knows a lot about, because there's a lot of them. So permaculture, if you have any interest in permaculture, compost forestry, keyline design and cultivation. I'm just reading off your website here, but natural building design. Mark does a lot of teaching in all of these fields, and is a wealth of information. So thank you, Mark, again for your time and for sharing it with us. And Natasha, show us what.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I just want to echo that, and Dan for managing the questions. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. So this is under if you just go to compostingvermont.org, it's under projects and Victory Gardens. And so here, this was just a little promo for today's webinar that we just did with Mark. And so this is where I'll be posting the video. I'll be posting it in full, and then I'm also going to cut it up. So there's just going to be a section on like the raised beds, and if, you know, so you can sort of drill into what you're looking for. We have some resources for people who are interested in more of the historical context, and some interesting videos about victory gardening and where that term comes from. And then really this is just some links about compost and soil health that you can get that's specific to gardening. And this is the section that Dan was referring to, supporting your local compost producers. And these are all the different, there are other, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the main compost producers throughout the state. There are some other ones, but they use most of the compost on their own farms. And so it's not really for commercial distribution. And here, these links go directly to the distribution or the distributor pages. So, or how to order it. So I tried to cut out the searching through some of these websites. And then I also we had first thought about having a map, but there's so many compost producers in the state of Vermont that use a huge variety of distributors, from Gardener Supply and Agways and Aubuchons and farm stores, and then from their facilities as well. So I just tried to give an idea of the region in Vermont. So you can look through here and hopefully pretty quickly see, you know, where near you could go. And if you have any questions, their phone numbers are there. Not everybody has websites, so I just put the contact information in place. And then we do also have, I just wanted to provide some quick links to the guidance that has been developed around compost. Finished compost should be completely fine, even in this time of COVID-19. But if anyone is interested, or if you're composting at home and want some guidance, those links are directly there, as well as a number of resources for just sort of primers on getting started to make your own composting. And then down at the bottom, and this will be a growing list, and ultimately this will likely branch out to be more than just everything on one page. But the UVM Extension Master Gardener Program has a number of Victory Garden specific projects run by the Master Gardeners in our state. And this one link will get you to all these different projects. And so that's a really great resource, including some on how to, you know, the Grow an Extra Row programs, or supporting those suffering from food insecurity right now. And so I encourage you to check those out. Vermont Community Gardens Network, among their other resources, they've started weekly garden chats with their staff and friends every Thursday. It's totally free. It's just a standing meeting. I have the link here that you can click on and just join. That it's pretty loosely structured. It depends on who shows up and what the questions are asked. They're not themed at this point, at least. And then Charlie Nardozzi, a name that many of you are familiar with, did do a free 1-hour vegetable victory garden webinar that goes over all the basics as well. Some about soil prep, but then also seed selection and all of his great information. And then here are just some links. And so I'll be adding the links that Mark shared today to probably up in the soil, or some in the gardening, depending on what they are. So this is just a quick overview. Yeah, so if anyone has specific questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them. But otherwise, it's really just to let you know that this resource is here, and it's going to be continuing to be built out. Great. And yeah, if you want to squeeze a few more questions, Mark, if you have another couple minutes.
I could probably take like maybe 3 more questions.
Okay, there's one about hugelkultur, which you touched on, but then somebody's wondering about growing fungi and how that fits into all this, if at all. And then one quick one was on occlusion, clear or black plastic was the big question there.
Yeah, I gave a private response to that person just through the chat, but so maybe those will be our 3 questions. And when I saw one one last one about composted sheep manure.
Right.
So occlusion versus or clear versus black. So my understanding is that clear plastic is used to solarize what's underneath, which is essentially kind of cooking the vegetation in order to kill it. Whereas occlusion, like as the kind of root of the word implies, is about, basically just restricting sunlight getting to it. And so that would be, an opaque plastic would be a way of occluding, versus clear plastic would be for solarizing. And I don't know, actually, there are going to be benefits and drawbacks to both, and I'm not really sure why one would do one or the other, but a lot of my friends that are doing this kind of no-till technique at the commercial scale are generally buying silage tarps, which are usually like the white, plastic type fabric that dairy farmers will use to cover up their silage piles. And you can get big tarps for pretty cheap. Like our local, I think it's Bordeaux Brothers in Middlebury. It's like a 30 by 100 foot, 30 foot by 100 foot tarp is like $135 if you were doing like a big area. And those can be, reused many times. And so those, in that case, they're using a white tarp. But I think that's going to be occluding rather than solarizing in that case. So that's all I can really offer there on that one. Hugelkultur is a technique that I believe originated in Germany, which is essentially mixing in woody debris within your planting bed. And there's different ways people do it. Sometimes, like if you're building up a new planting bed, you'd be essentially like laying down tree branches and brush and stuff like that. And then kind of like sheet mulching, then just like adding soil and organic matter on top of that as a way to build essentially a raised bed. I know in some cases, historically, they were actually excavating soil, filling the trench in, like digging a trench where the bed's going to go, putting the woody debris in there, and then piling the soil back on top. And the idea is that it's going to help create a more aerated bed. It's going to improve the water holding capacity. It's going to provide a lot of food for biology in the soil. So in like a sandy soil, it's going to help retain water. In a clay soil, it's going to kind of help you break things up and add organic matter like deeper in the soil. I don't have a lot of experience with it besides what I mentioned, just like, filling the base of a raised bed with branches and some brush and stuff like that, just as a way to kind of take up some of that space, but also know that I've got like a bit of a slow release fertilizer in my bed. Some people that I know that have done it have said that it's really created a lot more rodent challenges for them, because there's a lot of gaps that, just inevitably occur when you're trying to fill soil on top, add soil fill on top of all that brush. But then Sepp Holzer, who's the name of an Austrian kind of rock star grower, is a huge fan of it and has done, amazing things with challenging landscapes all over the world. And so, a lot of people really like it. So I can't really say, whether or not one should do it, but that's the essence of hugelkultur is integrating wood and woody debris into kind of a raised planting bed of sorts. There was a question. I have a pile of composted sheep manure from my neighbor's farm, which I tilled up and am planning to plant in. What kind of amendments should I focus on to restore a proper carbon and nitrogen balance in that medium? If it's composted sheep manure, I'm guessing that there was bedding mixed into it, be it, hay or wood shavings or something like that. Like, all of our sheep manure, we have a few sheep, and, it gets mixed in inevitably with spoiled hay or hay that they didn't eat or whatever. And so in that case, I'm not really worried too much about the carbon and nitrogen balance, because the manure is high nitrogen, but, the hay is going to help balance that out. So if there's nothing, if it's just straight up sheep manure, I'd find a hard time believing that there's a situation where you have that, just because it would be difficult to collect it, and it'd be a harsh environment to be raising sheep where there's that much just straight manure. But if it is, then I'd look at, mulch hay or shredded leaves. I don't know if wood shavings, can kind of mat together a bit too much. Sawdust, definitely not, just because it's kind of dense and very high carbon. But, that's what I would tend to look for. But I imagine that it's probably already pretty well balanced. And then what was the third question that you mentioned, Dan?
It was about fungi, but maybe we'll do a webinar on that on a future date.
Cool. Yeah. I would just say, look up the King Stropharia rugosa fungi. And that is a great species that can be kind of grown on wood chips within a garden bed that's existing.
Awesome. So nice. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We hope to have you back as we continue our Victory Garden webinar series. Maybe we can do one more intense on some of the other topics that you know so much about, but we really appreciate your time and all the information you shared today. Thanks to everybody for taking an hour and a half or so out of their day to join us. And thank you, Dan, as well, for managing the Q&A. That was great.
Excellent. Pleasure. Thank you all for making this happen.
All right. Take care, everybody.